I still remember the moment my phone buzzed nonstop, 89 missed calls by sunrise. My parents had sent a group message saying, "We think it's best you step away for now." My aunt reacted with a thumbs up. I stared at the screen, heart racing, asking myself, and did they really mean it? Something in me knew this wasn't just a request, it was a test, and maybe a trap. So I sent one calm reply. "Understood, I'll respect that, and step away from the family fun too." Little did they know, what I had prepared would change everything. Can you guess what happened next? I had always believed that loyalty to family was the highest form of love. At 35, I carried that belief like armor, unaware it had been slowly shaping my life into a series of compromises. Every birthday, every small victory, every unexpected bill, I was there, ready to offer help, guidance, or a loan. I posted updates online about my successes, thinking my family would celebrate them alongside me, unaware that each post also mapped out my patterns, my priorities, my vulnerabilities. Looking back now, I can see the subtle signs I ignored, the moments I should have paused and asked myself why giving so much never seemed enough. My parents called late one night, and as always, I answered. The voice on the line carried urgency, but behind it lingered a subtle accusation. "Claire, can you handle this for us?" they asked. It was never a request. It was a quiet demand wrapped in care. My stomach twisted as I agreed, as I always did. Later, I would realize how these late-night calls trained me to respond immediately, without hesitation, without boundaries. They shaped my life into a cycle where my needs came last. I remember looking at my phone the night they sent that group message. "We think it's best you step away for now." My heart sank when I saw my aunt's reaction, a thumbs-up emoji. A small, simple symbol, yet somehow it felt like a verdict. I poured a cup of tea and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the screen. The room was quiet, but my mind raced. Could a single emoji carry such power? Did my family really see me as an inconvenience, as someone to be sidelined? And yet, I hesitated. I had spent so long defining myself by their approval that the idea of stepping away felt unnatural, even wrong. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside me. I reminded myself that helping them was never a crime, yet I also knew I had given until I was exhausted, until I began to wonder if I had lost myself along the way. Late-night messages weren't new to me. My parents would reach out at odd hours, demanding assistance, asking for money, or expecting me to mediate conflicts between relatives. I had learned to answer every call, to respond to every text, because ignoring them felt like betrayal. But each act of compliance chipped away at my sense of self. The more I gave, the more I realized that my generosity was often met with expectation rather than gratitude. When my aunt silently observed, monitoring every post and every financial move, I had no idea it would later feed into strategies I wasn't even aware they were planning. Her quiet presence felt harmless, even comforting at times, but in truth, it was another thread in the web I had been weaving around myself. I closed my laptop and leaned back, trying to untangle the knot of guilt and loyalty. The glow of the screen faded into the dark room, and for a moment, I let myself just breathe. It was strange, the relief in solitude, the quiet realization that no one else could define my worth in that moment. The thought was fleeting but powerful. I could pause, I could reflect, I could start to reclaim pieces of myself. And yet, I couldn't ignore the lingering doubt. I had been trained to give, to respond, to comply. Could I truly step away without chaos erupting? Could I finally assert that my life was my own? The signs had been there all along. Requests for last-minute money, subtle criticisms, manipulative phrasing hidden in polite conversation. Each a brushstroke painting the larger picture of my family's reliance on my compliance. Even when I recognized a red flag, I often rationalized it, telling myself that family is complicated, that love is messy, that I had the responsibility to endure discomfort for the greater good. But the pattern was unmistakable. The more I gave, the more they extracted, and the more I questioned my own worth. I began to notice the ways my aunt would react online, tracking my activity without comment, silently assessing. The micro cliffhangers in my own life were everywhere, hidden in a text, a call, a subtle pause, a thumbs up. One night, after yet another call at 2:15 a.m., I sat alone with a notebook and began to jot down every instance I could remember where my efforts had been met with manipulation rather than appreciation. It was exhausting, but the act of writing created a pause, a moment of clarity. I could see the emotional loops I had been trapped in, the ways I had justified behavior that wasn't healthy. I realized I had been complicit, yes, but not with malice, with hope, with love, with the belief that family should come first. As I finished my tea, I allowed myself a quiet acknowledgement of that vulnerability. I was human, I was tired, and I was finally beginning to see the path that might allow me to reclaim my life. My heart still ached at the thought of stepping away, but I also understood that this was the first step toward a life defined not by obligation, but by choice. For the first time in years, I felt the possibility that I could act not out of fear or guilt, but out of wisdom, strategy, and self-respect. By the time the early morning light seeped into the room, I had resolved to pay closer attention, to observe, and to plan. The vulnerability that had once been my weakness could now become a source of insight. I wasn't ready to fight yet, but I was ready to see clearly, to feel fully, and to recognize the subtle manipulations that had long controlled me. For the first time, I could begin to imagine a future where my decisions were mine alone. And in that fragile hope, I sensed the power that had always been quietly building inside me, waiting for the moment it could finally awaken. The notification popped up on my phone, breaking the fragile calm I had built that morning. "We think it's best you step away for now." The words sat on the screen like a verdict. I stared at them, heart pounding, waiting for the familiar surge of guilt to wash over me. But then I saw it, a thumbs-up emoji from my aunt. Just one small symbol, but it felt heavier than a sentence of criticism. I blinked, unsure if I should laugh, cry, or scream. Was this really happening? Or was it some cruel joke I wasn't supposed to understand yet? I put my phone down, hands trembling, and took a slow breath. In the past, moments like this would have triggered an immediate response, a frantic explanation, or an apology I didn't even know I owed. But today I chose to sit in silence. I watched, I observed, I allowed the pause to stretch out longer than I had ever permitted myself. My mind ran through every interaction over the past few years. The late-night calls, the subtle criticisms, the moments I had given too much and received too little. And in that quiet, the truth settled uncomfortably. This wasn't about family love. This was about control. I thought about how many times I had been the first to act, the one to jump at every request, the one to maintain the peace. I realized the pattern: compliance, gratitude denied, repeat. The group message, simple as it was, finally exposed the boundary they had quietly imposed, and the emoji, my aunt's silent agreement, added another layer I hadn't anticipated. A small gesture, but somehow devastating in its quiet finality. I wondered if I didn't respond, if I stayed silent. Would the tension dissipate on its own, or would it fester like it always had? I picked up my cup of tea again, the warmth a small comfort against the anxiety coiling in my chest. I imagined the reactions, the questions they would ask, the assumptions they would make. But instead of rushing to clarify or justify, I allowed the silence to linger. There was power in observing. There was power in knowing that I could respond on my own terms, rather than being swept up by the currents of obligation and guilt. For the first time, the possibility of choosing my actions rather than simply reacting felt tangible. By midnight, I had made a decision. The family fund contributions I had managed for years, the accounts I had controlled, the funds I had always redirected at their request, everything was being closed. Carefully, methodically, I followed the steps I had been preparing in my mind for weeks without admitting it to myself. Each confirmation on the screen, each final click, felt like a quiet rebellion. A reclaiming of space I hadn't realized I had lost. The act was deliberate, not vengeful. I wasn't trying to punish them. I was creating a boundary I should have established long ago. The night stretched on, and I slept fitfully, knowing what the morning would bring. My phone began to buzz as the first light touched the sky. One notification, two, then dozens more. 89 missed calls staring back at me like accusations. A voicemail from my father cut through the tension, his voice trembling. "Claire, what happened? The bank flagged everything." I didn't panic. I didn't justify. I typed a simple response, letting the weight of my decision speak louder than words. "I'm honoring your decision." The calm in my own heart contrasted sharply with the chaos erupting on the other end. I watched as my careful planning began to manifest in real time. The consequences of years of manipulation finally reaching them. I didn't feel triumphant, nor did I feel joy in their panic. I felt a strange clarity, a realization that for the first time, the power to act and the responsibility for my own life rested firmly in my hands. Still, fear lingered. The missed calls and urgent voicemails reminded me that my actions would ripple outward, unseen but felt. And the world I had tried to control through compliance was now colliding with the one I had begun to define for myself. What if they retaliated? What if my careful calculations were flawed? Even as I felt the thrill of autonomy, I acknowledged the anxiety clinging to the edges of my mind. Yet for the first time, I understood that fear did not need to paralyze me. It could inform my decisions, sharpen my strategies, and remind me that I was finally awake. Sitting with that knowledge, I began to map out the possibilities. Each call unanswered, each message ignored, was not a failure, it was a signal. I could anticipate their next moves, gauge their reactions, and act with precision. The realization that my power had always existed quietly beneath the surface was both humbling and liberating. I wasn't striking out blindly. I was stepping into a space I had prepared for myself, and in that space, I could breathe without guilt, without expectation. As the morning light grew stronger, I allowed myself a quiet smile. I was afraid, yes, but I was also awake. The breaking point was not just a moment of crisis, it was the threshold into a new understanding of what I could control and who I could become. The group message, the emoji, the frantic calls, they had all been catalysts. The real decision, the one that mattered, was mine alone. And for the first time in years, I felt the subtle, powerful relief of autonomy coursing through me, untainted by obligation and tempered by the awareness that this was only the beginning. I spent the next few days immersed in quiet observation, tracking every interaction that could reveal patterns I had once ignored. The group chat, once a casual space of family banter, now became a source of data. I cataloged messages, noting the timing, the phrasing, the subtle ways my parents manipulated tone and expectation. Each emoji, each delayed reply, became a breadcrumb I could follow. My heart raced with a mix of fear and exhilaration every time I discovered another detail, another thread that tied past manipulations together. The realization that I had the tools to anticipate their actions was both terrifying and empowering. Financial records followed the same meticulous scrutiny. Years of contributions, transfers, and reimbursements revealed patterns of expectation and control I had never consciously noticed. And then, tucked away in an account I rarely accessed, I found it, a sum that had been quietly accumulating, overlooked by those who believed they controlled every resource. My pulse quickened. This hidden reservoir wasn't just money, it was the leverage I needed to ensure my decisions carried weight. The foundation for the autonomy I had only begun to grasp. For the first time, I realized I held the cards in a game they had assumed I could never play. As I documented these discoveries, I felt the thrill of clarity settling into my chest. The chaos of past interactions began to resolve into patterns I could read, anticipate, and act upon. Each entry in my notebook, each record saved, was a small victory, a step toward reclaiming authority over a life I had let others shape. Micro cliffhanger thoughts crept in. What if they noticed my digging? What if my aunt realized I had uncovered the hidden sum? The tension built quietly, underpinning each decision with the awareness that I was entering a new phase of control. But knowledge alone was not enough. I knew that strategy required allies, a network to consult and corroborate with. I reached out discreetly to a lawyer, explaining my situation in broad strokes, careful not to disclose more than necessary. A therapist provided guidance on managing the emotional weight of observing my family's patterns without succumbing to rage. A financial advisor helped me understand how best to leverage the hidden assets, ensuring I could act decisively without leaving myself vulnerable. These professionals were not just practical aids, they were shields, each one a quiet assurance that I would not face the aftermath alone. I also began to establish hidden channels of communication. Encrypted emails, secondary phone numbers, and a private notebook allowed me to record observations without interference. Each note contained both facts and reflections, sometimes addressed to myself, sometimes phrased as questions to the reader. If you were watching, what would you have noticed that I missed? These interactions, subtle and unseen, kept me grounded while sharpening my perception. The act of writing became a silent conversation, a mirror reflecting the careful steps I had taken to reclaim authority. Then, unexpectedly, a cousin outside the immediate family reached out. Their words were cautious, measured, but contained insights that reshaped my understanding of long-standing dynamics. They confirmed suspicions I had only begun to form, revealing information that had been hidden in plain sight. My mind raced as I integrated this new intelligence into the framework I had been building. Every detail added depth to the strategy I was constructing, every revelation a potential turning point. The micro cliffhanger persisted. How would this information be used? And when the time came, how would it reshape the balance of power I was beginning to command? I spent hours reviewing the data, cross-referencing messages with financial records, tracing every anomaly, and creating a timeline that mapped influence, expectation, and reaction. It was painstaking, exhausting, and exhilarating all at once. I felt both fear and confidence coursing through me, a recognition that the very forces that had constrained me could now be anticipated, countered, and redirected. Each discovery was a stepping stone, each calculation a measure of my emerging autonomy. Yet I was careful not to allow myself to become detached, to transform into the cold strategist I feared I might become. I noted the emotional weight of each observation, the frustration, the disappointment, the lingering affection for those who had shaped me, flawed as they were. In maintaining my humanity, I ensured that my strategy remained grounded, ethical in its intent, precise in execution, and protective of the person I had fought to preserve. This was not about punishment. It was about reclaiming authority, about asserting boundaries, about securing freedom. By the end of the week, I had built a framework that combined insight, resources, and support. Each move I might make was mapped, each potential reaction considered. I understood the balance of power in a way I never had before. The tools I had accumulated, the records, the hidden assets, the professional advice, and the cousin's intelligence formed a quiet arsenal. I didn't feel invincible, but I felt prepared. For the first time, I could navigate the coming conflicts with clarity rather than fear, anticipation rather than reaction, and autonomy rather than compliance. As I closed my notebook, I paused to reflect. The journey through observation and intelligence gathering had changed me. I was no longer just a participant in my family's drama. I was a strategist, aware, prepared, and deliberate. The vulnerabilities that had once left me exposed now offered insight. And in the silence of that moment, I allowed myself a quiet acknowledgement of power. Not power over others, but power over the choices and the life I was reclaiming. I could see the path ahead with precision, and for the first time, I knew that when the time came, I would not be caught off guard. The breaking point had passed. Now came the strategy, and with it, the chance to shape the outcome on my terms. The morning light had barely touched my apartment when the first notifications arrived. My careful execution of the family fund withdrawal had triggered an immediate ripple. Bank alerts flooded my phone, but I remained calm, sipping my coffee as though nothing had happened. The chaos unfolding on the other side of the screen was a symphony I had been waiting for, a validation of months of observation, planning, and patience. I watched the missed calls accumulate, the messages piling up, and I felt neither triumph nor malice, only a quiet certainty that I was finally operating on my own terms. I wondered who would realize first, my parents, overwhelmed by the sudden financial shifts, or my aunt, silently monitoring my actions from afar. The suspense twisted in my stomach, a tension I had carefully allowed to build. Every ring, every ping of a notification felt like a heartbeat counting down to the moment of revelation. My aunt's silent observation had always been a threat in the background, a shadow I respected but never confronted directly. Now that shadow loomed larger, its reaction unpredictable, capable of complicating the carefully laid plans I had constructed. As I navigated my day, I deliberately delayed engagement, allowing them to experience the full impact of their assumptions and oversights. Each pause, each interval of inaction served as a mirror for the consequences they had imposed on me for so long. Micro cliffhangers filled the hours. Would my father call first, desperate and confused, or would my aunt reach out, cryptically probing, trying to test my resolve? I could almost feel their frustration and panic radiating across the digital waves, a silent acknowledgement of the boundaries I had finally drawn. The financial shift was only the beginning. The true art of strategic revenge lay not in immediate chaos, but in the careful orchestration of psychological dominoes. I observed from a distance as my parents scrambled to understand the changes, their confusion amplifying with each unanswered call and each ignored message. My aunt, ever the silent strategist, reacted subtly. A message here, a question there, intended to probe my intentions and sway the narrative. But I anticipated this, and it only reinforced the careful balance I had struck between action and restraint. I brewed another cup of coffee and allowed myself a moment to reflect. I didn't feel hatred toward them. That was never my aim. I felt protective of myself, aware of the long years in which my loyalty had been exploited. The act of withdrawal, the measured silence, the observation of their panic, all were steps toward reclaiming my autonomy, not instruments of revenge born from anger. Yet even in that clarity, I acknowledged the undercurrent of unpredictability. My aunt's subtle manipulations could still introduce variables I had not foreseen. By mid-morning, the larger family began to notice the shifts. Whispers traveled through group chats and phone calls, confusion spreading like wildfire. Messages were sent, calls made, each met with careful silence on my end. I documented their reactions meticulously, noting patterns, deviations, and emotional cues. This information would be invaluable for the next stage of my strategy, should I need it. Micro cliffhangers persisted with each interaction. Who would fold under pressure first, who would attempt to manipulate, and who would face the consequences of their assumptions? And then the twist arrived. Amidst the financial scramble, an old family secret emerged unexpectedly, surfacing in a conversation that had been casually overlooked for years. The revelation added a new dimension to the situation, a complication I had not predicted, yet one that aligned with the principle of controlled exposure. The secret was harmless in intent, but devastating in impact, reshaping perceptions and forcing previously hidden truths into the open. The dominoes of psychology continued to fall, each one guided by my measured restraint and careful orchestration. Sitting quietly with my coffee, I allowed the tension to settle for a moment. The dramatic upheaval unfolding before me was balanced by a rare, reflective pause. I reminded myself that this was not about punishment. It was about clarity, accountability, and boundaries. I observed their reactions with compassion for my own needs, not with vengeance for their actions. Each revelation, each ripple of consequence, was a reflection of the patterns I had endured and the autonomy I was reclaiming. By late afternoon, the initial panic had evolved into a series of ripple effects. Extended family, friends, and acquaintances began to notice subtle inconsistencies, and the truth that had long been buried in assumptions started to take shape. My aunt, realizing that her silent strategies could no longer influence outcomes in the way she expected, became an unpredictable variable. Her attempts to control perception were thwarted by the clarity and decisiveness of my actions, and the stage was set for the next revelation, the one that would carry the consequences into the broader family network. I leaned back and sipped the last of my coffee, feeling the weight of the morning settle into a quiet, deliberate satisfaction. The strategic moves had been executed precisely, the psychological dominoes in motion, and yet there remained room for subtlety, for reflection, for the careful guidance of outcomes without overstepping into vindictiveness. I had maintained my humanity throughout, measured in action, deliberate in silence, and prepared for the twists that inevitably accompany any confrontation with long-held family patterns. And as the final notifications came in, a shiver of anticipation ran through me. A new secret, buried for decades, had been unearthed by forces I could neither fully control nor predict. And I understood immediately that this revelation would set the stage for the next chapter of consequence. The delicate balance of timing, observation, and psychological insight had brought me to this point, and the outcome, still uncertain, promised to reshape the family dynamics in ways that no one could have anticipated. The dominoes were falling, and I was ready to watch them land. The morning after the fund withdrawal felt surreal. My phone vibrated relentlessly, 89 missed calls stacking one after another, each one a testament to the storm I had quietly set in motion. The voicemails left behind carried panic, confusion, and desperation. My father's voice trembled as he asked questions I couldn't answer without revealing my strategy too soon. My mother's tone wavered between accusation and pleading. I let the calls ring unanswered. There was no joy in hearing them panic, only a steady awareness that the consequences of their manipulation were finally unfolding in real time. I watched, almost clinically, as the family began to react. Each unanswered call and ignored message heightened the tension. A reflection of the years I had spent being manipulated into immediate compliance. Micro cliffhanger thoughts ran through my mind. Who would be the first to truly accept the truth? Would they recognize that the leverage they believed they had over me no longer existed? Or would they double down on old patterns, demanding explanations they had never considered necessary before? The uncertainty of their reactions made each moment more compelling, not just for me, but for anyone who could observe the subtle power shifts in play. Unexpectedly, voices from beyond the immediate conflict began to emerge. A cousin who had previously remained neutral reached out privately, expressing understanding and support for my actions. Other relatives, long silent observers, chimed in with cautious acknowledgement, reinforcing that my position was not isolated. This created a ripple effect, subtle but undeniable, as whispers and quiet approvals spread through family channels. The micro cliffhanger persisted. Who else might quietly side with me, tipping the balance in ways my parents and aunt could not anticipate? By afternoon, the reality of the situation became undeniable for those involved. The panic subsided into recognition. Calls that had been frantic transformed into measured attempts to understand the situation, tempered by the acknowledgement that their previous assumptions had been wrong. The initial chaos had given way to clarity. My decision to step away from the fund, to assert boundaries was not an act of rebellion, but an act of self-preservation. And yet, even in the midst of this reckoning, I remained cautious, observing, ensuring that each move was deliberate and grounded. As the hours passed, I began to reveal previously hidden truths. Financial records that had been buried, overlooked, or misrepresented over the years were brought to light. It was not done to punish but to clarify, to provide transparency, and to reassert fairness in a context that had long lacked it. The social proof was undeniable. Those who had doubted my judgment, those who had assumed my compliance was weakness, now had evidence that my actions were guided by foresight and careful strategy. Karma, subtle and precise, had begun to manifest in ways that aligned with the principles of justice I had always believed in. I allowed myself a quiet pause, sipping a cup of coffee while watching the responses unfold. The satisfaction was layered, not a simple thrill of victory. It was complex, relief that I had acted correctly, validation that my assessment of patterns had been accurate, and cautious observation of how consequences might continue to ripple outward. Micro cliffhangers emerged in small details. Who would apologize first? Who would confront the truth directly? Who would attempt to regain influence through subtle pressure? Each moment carried weight, shaping the evolving landscape of family dynamics. The impact of transparency extended beyond immediate relief. Extended family members who had previously observed from the sidelines began to reassess relationships and allegiances. Supportive messages arrived in quiet, careful tones, acknowledging my actions and providing the emotional reinforcement that had been absent for so long. This created a network of indirect validation, a subtle but powerful confirmation that my decisions were not only justified but respected. Micro cliffhanger thoughts crept in again. What unintended consequences might emerge next, and how could I continue to navigate them without compromising the autonomy I had claimed? Over the following days, I noticed patterns stabilizing. My parents, though initially resistant, began to engage with reality, adjusting expectations and, in some cases, acknowledging boundaries I had set. My aunt, while less vocal, had to reconcile her assumptions with the visible shifts in family dynamics. The domino effect of recognition and validation spread quietly, like a chain reaction, and I observed it with deliberate detachment. It was proof that strategic patience, careful observation, and consistent action could create meaningful change without resorting to aggression. Finally, I allowed a moment of emotional release. I reflected on the journey from vulnerability to recognition, from passive compliance to careful, deliberate action. The consequences had been realized, justice had been subtly enforced, and the equilibrium of power had shifted. Yet I remained human, aware of the complexity of relationships, the lingering connections of shared history, and the need for compassion even in the face of prior manipulation. The satisfaction was complete, but tempered by the understanding that maintaining boundaries would require ongoing attention and self-awareness. By the end of the week, a quiet sense of empowerment settled over me. I had acted decisively without malice, guided by strategy and insight rather than impulse. The long-term validation was not merely in the recognition of my parents or aunt, but in the establishment of autonomy, financial independence, and clarity of boundaries. Socially and emotionally, the ripple effect reinforced that respect, trust, and fairness could be reasserted even in the most complex of family dynamics. In the calm that followed, I understood that the real victory was not the reactions of others, but the clarity, confidence, and integrity I had cultivated within myself. The days that followed felt like a quiet rebirth. I had established boundaries that were once unimaginable. Digital, financial, physical. My phone no longer dictated my schedule. I controlled when and how I communicated. Family fund access was fully restricted, my accounts secure, and I had set strict protocols for selective contact. Every email, message, and call passed through filters of intention and necessity. I didn't need to react to every ping or inquiry. The power I once gave away freely was now carefully preserved, a resource I could protect without guilt. Yet even with these unbreachable barriers, unease lingered. Micro cliffhanger thoughts crept in. Would they ever test these boundaries again? Could old patterns resurface despite my vigilance? I allowed myself to acknowledge the worry without letting it control me. I was no longer a prisoner to anxiety or obligation, but human enough to feel apprehensive. This balance between self-protection and self-awareness was fragile, but it grounded me. A reminder that empowerment didn't require perfection, only presence and resolve. With boundaries firmly in place, I began to rebuild the aspects of my life that had been neglected or suppressed. Work, hobbies, and personal passions that I had sidelined for years were no longer luxuries, but priorities. I pursued creative projects I had abandoned, took classes I had long postponed, and dedicated time to building relationships with people who nurtured rather than drained me. Each choice reinforced my autonomy. Each success, however small, became a testament to the life I had reclaimed. The act of thriving was quiet, but it carried the weight of liberation. The most surprising shift was in my social awareness. Freed from constant manipulation, I found clarity in the patterns I had endured. I recognized them not only in my family, but in the experiences of others. Conversations with friends revealed similar struggles, hidden manipulations, subtle coercion, the quiet undermining of confidence. I began to share my journey cautiously, offering insights and guidance without judgment. A ripple effect emerged. People I had known only casually began to open up about their own experiences, inspired by the example of reclaiming control without conflict. This, I realized, was another layer of empowerment, the ability to help others recognize their own worth and autonomy. I also nurtured relationships that had previously been secondary or tentative. With clearer boundaries, I could approach friendships and professional connections with honesty and authenticity. Trust became a choice, not a default assumption. I discovered joy in interactions that were mutual, supportive, and affirming. The freedom to invest energy in people who valued me created a sense of abundance I had never felt while trapped in cycles of obligation and manipulation. The realization was profound. Thriving was not about proving anything to my family, but about honoring the life I wanted to live. Financial independence grew alongside emotional clarity. The resources I had uncovered and safeguarded became tools for stability and opportunity. Investments I had once made for others were redirected toward projects and goals that fulfilled me personally and professionally. Budgeting and planning became acts of self-respect rather than obligation. Each transaction, each decision, reinforced my autonomy and provided tangible evidence of the life I had begun to craft on my own terms. Even in moments of quiet reflection, I remained vigilant. Micro cliffhanger thoughts occasionally surfaced. Would my parents or aunt test these boundaries again? Would old habits resurface in subtle ways? But instead of panic, I met these questions with preparation and confidence. I knew my responses would be deliberate, grounded in insight and strategy rather than impulse. The experience had taught me that empowerment is not a state achieved once, but a practice maintained continuously. By mid-year, the transformation was evident not only in my life, but in the lives of those I had influenced. Friends and colleagues began to recognize subtle signs of family abuse and toxic dynamics, seeking guidance in ways that echoed the lessons I had internalized. I realized my story had become a blueprint, a quiet model demonstrating that it was possible to reclaim agency, set boundaries, and thrive authentically. The ripple effect extended beyond my immediate circle, and I felt a sense of responsibility tempered by humility. I spent quiet evenings reflecting on the journey, from the late-night calls that had once dictated my every action, through the strategic withdrawal of the family fund, to the subtle orchestration of psychological consequences, and the ultimate reclamation of my autonomy. Each step had been deliberate, measured, and informed by self-awareness. I did not feel victorious over others, nor did I carry bitterness. My satisfaction was rooted in clarity, integrity, and the knowledge that I had cultivated a life defined by choice rather than obligation. The final lesson settled softly but profoundly. Empowerment was not the absence of vulnerability, but the mastery of it. Liberation was not about revenge or dominance, but about establishing and respecting limits, understanding patterns, and reclaiming agency. Thriving was not a sudden transformation, but a sustained practice, reinforced daily through choices that honored self-respect and authenticity. I had navigated betrayal, observed manipulation, and acted strategically without losing my humanity. In the calm of my new routine, I smiled, acknowledging the subtle power I had reclaimed, the boundaries I had set, the clarity I had gained, and the life I was living reflected not just survival, but growth, resilience, and deliberate flourishing. I could now engage with the world and with people on my own terms, confident that the choices I made were for me and me alone. The journey had taken years, yet the destination felt immediate. Empowered, liberated, thriving. A life of my own design, unburdened by the manipulation that once defined it.